The boardroom smelled like polished wood, expensive cologne, and betrayal. I knew that smell well. I had helped choose the table, the chairs, even the stupid abstract painting on the far wall that everyone pretended to understand. I had scheduled this very meeting 3 weeks ago, coordinating calendars, chasing directors who thought punctuality was optional, making sure the projector worked because God forbid the new CEO look unprepared on his big day. My brother sat at the head of the table now, Daniel. He wore confidence like a tailored suit, the kind that still felt a little stiff because it was brand new. His hands rested flat on the table, fingers spread, claiming territory. Our family's company logo glowed behind him on the screen, the same logo I had helped rebrand 5 years earlier when sales were tanking and no one else knew what to do. I sat 2 seats down, not at the head, not even close. I hadn't sat there in years. I didn't need to. My influence had never depended on a chair. "Thank you all for coming," Daniel said, his voice smooth, practiced. He had rehearsed this, I could tell. He always over-rehearsed when he was nervous. "As you know, today marks a new chapter for our company." Polite nods circled the table, a few smiles, a few people avoided my eyes. Interesting. Daniel continued talking about vision, growth, synergy, all the usual corporate poetry that said nothing and sounded important. I let my gaze wander, studying the faces around the table, men and women I had hired, people whose careers I had quietly saved during bad quarters, people who had called me late at night, panicked, asking for advice they were now pretending they'd never needed. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "There is one more matter to address." There it was. His eyes flicked toward me for half a second, then away again. He gestured toward HR, who stiffened like a deer sensing headlights. "Effective immediately," Daniel said. "We are restructuring executive responsibilities." I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms. My heart didn't race, it slowed, and as part of that restructuring, he continued, "The role currently held by my brother is no longer required." The room went very quiet. "Your services are no longer required," Daniel said, the words landing like a gavel. "Please clear your office by tomorrow." I looked at him, really looked at him, the boy who used to follow me around the warehouse during summer breaks. The kid who cried when Dad yelled and ran to me instead. The brother who once begged me to cover for him when he lost a 6-figure client because he'd forgotten a deadline. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. I nodded calmly. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Someone else stared very hard at their notepad, and then it happened. I laughed, not loudly, not hysterically. Just a quiet, uncontrollable chuckle that slipped out before I could stop it. It surprised even me. I covered my mouth for a second, as if that would help, then let my hand drop. "I understand." I said evenly, "Congratulations on the promotion." Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected that. Security wasn't called. There was no dramatic escort out. I gathered my notebook, stood up, and walked out of the boardroom I had helped design. My footsteps echoing softly on the floor. No one stopped me. My office looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Family photos on the shelf. A framed article about the company's turnaround with my name buried politely in the 3rd paragraph. A plant I kept alive out of spite because everyone said I couldn't. I sat down and looked around. 10 years. 10 years of 16-hour days, of missing birthdays, of swallowing my pride every time Dad brushed past my ideas only to praise Daniel for repeating them later. 10 years of being the invisible spine holding the whole thing upright, and Daniel thought he'd won. I packed slowly, not because I was sad, but because I was curious about how much of myself I had scattered across this room. Old contracts, backup drives, a leather folder containing copies of agreements no one else remembered existed. I smiled to myself. By the time I left, the sun was already low. I handed my badge to the receptionist, wished her a good evening, and walked out into the parking lot. I didn't look back. At home that night, I poured myself a drink and sat on the balcony, the city humming below. My phone buzzed a few times, messages from colleagues, one from our mother, confused and worried. One from Daniel that I didn't open. I stared at the lights and laughed again, this time louder, because Daniel had made a mistake. He thought firing me meant removing me, what he didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that I wasn't just an employee. I was the architect. 3 years earlier, when Dad's health had started failing, he'd pulled me aside in the hospital hallway. The smell of antiseptic still clung to the memory. "Your brother is good with people," Dad had said quietly. "But he doesn't see the whole board." I had nodded. "I need you to prepare for contingencies," he'd continued, "things no one else needs to know about." That was the day everything changed. Shell companies. Silent partnerships, fail-safes buried so deep they looked like routine paperwork. Systems designed not to collapse, but to transfer control quietly when certain conditions were met. Conditions like executive termination clauses. Conditions like hostile internal restructuring. Conditions like arrogance. Daniel never asked why I insisted on handling certain contracts myself. He never wondered why key clients insisted on dealing only with me, even after he became CEO. He thought loyalty was automatic. Next morning would be fun. I woke up early, showered, and dressed carefully. Not in a suit, but in something comfortable. I made coffee and checked my phone. 12 missed calls. I finally opened Daniel's message. "We need to talk." I smiled and took a sip of coffee. At 8:47 a.m., my email pinged. At 8:49, it pinged again. At 8:52, my phone started ringing nonstop. Because at exactly 8:45, a series of automated notifications had gone out. To banks, to partners, to regulatory bodies, to 3 major clients whose contracts included a little-known clause stating that if I were removed without my written consent, ownership percentages would temporarily shift pending review. Daniel was probably standing in his glass office now, staring at his screen, realizing that the company he thought he owned was suddenly uncertain, and this was only the beginning. I finished my coffee, picked up my keys, and headed out. I still had an office to clear, just not the one he thought. I arrived downtown just after 9, parked 2 blocks away from the glass tower that carried our family name in brushed steel letters. The same building Daniel was probably pacing inside right now, barking questions at assistants who suddenly didn't have answers. I didn't go in. Instead, I crossed the street and entered a smaller building most people mistook for a law office. No sign, no logo, just a discreet directory listing a dozen boring-sounding firms. I nodded at the receptionist, who already knew my name, and took the elevator to the 7th floor, the real office. This one had no family photos, no awards on the wall, just clean lines, locked cabinets, and a long table covered in neatly stacked folders. My world, the world Daniel had never been invited into. "Morning," Claire said, looking up from her laptop. She didn't sound surprised to see me. She rarely was. "How bad is it?" I asked, loosening my jacket. She turned her screen toward me. Red indicators glowed like warning lights. 3 banks froze discretionary credit lines. 2 partners invoked review clauses, and one of the overseas distributors has already requested written clarification on executive authority. I smiled. "So, chaos, controlled chaos," she corrected, "exactly how you designed it." I sat down, finally letting myself feel it. Not anger, not pain, satisfaction. The kind that settles deep and warm in your chest when a long equation finally balances. "Any word from Daniel?" I asked. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Other than him calling you 14 times in the last hour." I chuckled, let him sweat. By mid-morning, the boardroom I'd left the day before was on fire. Not literally, but close enough. Directors were demanding explanations. Lawyers were being summoned. Daniel's carefully rehearsed confidence was cracking, replaced by something rower and far less attractive. Panic. He finally cornered me at noon. My phone lit up again, and this time I answered. "What did you do?" He snapped, skipping pleasantries. "Good afternoon to you too." I said calmly. "This isn't funny," he said. "Accounts are locked. Clients are threatening to walk. You need to fix this now." I leaned back in my chair. "You fired me." "That doesn't." He stopped himself, breathing hard. "This is family. You can't just sabotage the company." Sabotage. I almost laughed again. "I didn't sabotage anything." I said, "I followed the agreements. Agreements you signed without reading, I might add. Silence. Then, quieter, what agreements? I stood and walked to the window, watching traffic crawl below. The ones Dad asked me to put in place, the ones designed to protect the company from impulsive leadership. You went behind my back, he demanded. No, I corrected. I went around you. There's a difference. His voice dropped. Fix this, or I swear, or what? I interrupted. You'll fire me again. That did it. He hung up. An hour later, Claire walked in with a thin smile. Emergency board meeting called for 4. Of course it is. I said, are they inviting me? They're begging. I arrived at the tower this time. Security hesitated when they saw me, then stepped aside after a quick call. Word travels fast when power shifts. The elevator ride up felt surreal, like revisiting a dream I'd already woken from. The boardroom was packed. Daniel stood at the head again, but the posture was wrong now. Shoulders tense, jaw tight, sweat darkening the collar of that expensive suit. He stopped talking when I entered. Every eye turned toward me. I took my old seat, not the one near the head, the one that let me see everyone. Let's get this over with, I said. The chairman cleared his throat. We need clarification on the recent. Disruptions, of course. I replied, they're not disruptions, they're safeguards. I slid a folder across the table. Then another, each contained documentation. Contracts, clauses, signatures, proof that my role in the company went far beyond a job title. These structures were designed to ensure stability. I continued. Specifically, in the event of a sudden executive change without unanimous board consent. The chairman frowned. You're saying Daniel's appointment was procedurally valid. I said smoothly, but his termination of me was not. Daniel's face went pale. You can't do this, he said quietly. You planned this. I prepared. I corrected again. There's a difference. Murmurs rippled around the table. So what happens now? Someone asked. I folded my hands. Now the company enters a temporary oversight period. Certain powers revert to holding entities. Certain decisions require my sign-off. Daniel stared at me. You're stealing my company. I finally looked directly at him. I'm saving it from you. The vote happened quickly after that, not because I forced it, because fear is persuasive. By the time the meeting ended, Daniel was still CEO in name. But only just. Every meaningful decision would pass through layers he didn't control. Layers I did. As people filed out, he stopped me. You humiliated me, he said through clenched teeth. I leaned in, my voice low. No, you did that yourself. I just let it happen. He swallowed. This isn't over. I smiled. It never is. That night, I went home exhausted but calm. The kind of calm that comes after a storm, breaks exactly where you aimed it. But revenge, I'd learned, isn't a single moment. It's a process. And Daniel was about to learn how slow and how thorough I could be. Daniel stopped calling me after that meeting, not because things were resolved, but because he finally understood something about me that he'd spent his whole life ignoring. I didn't bluff and I didn't rush. Silence, when used properly, was far more unsettling than threats. For the next 2 weeks, the company moved like an injured animal, slow, cautious. Every decision stalled under review, every email copied to too many lawyers. Daniel still sat in the CEO chair, still gave speeches about confidence and forward momentum, but the staff could feel it. The power behind his words was gone. They watched him now the way people watch a storm from behind glass, curious but detached. I stayed out of the building. That bothered him more than anything else. Instead, I worked from the 7th floor office, the one Dad had insisted never carry the family name. Claire and I spent long days reviewing numbers, quietly shifting pressure points. Not enough to cause collapse, never that, but enough to make Daniel's mistakes visible, and he made plenty. He rushed a supplier renegotiation to prove decisiveness. The supplier called me instead. He tried to sideline a senior operations director who'd sided with me during the vote. That director resigned on the spot and took 2 regional managers with her. Every move he made to reassert control only revealed how little he understood the machinery underneath him. One evening, as the city lights flickered on outside the window, Claire closed her laptop and looked at me carefully. You know he's spiraling, she said. I know. And you're not stopping. No. She hesitated. This stopped being about the company a few steps back. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about a different boardroom years earlier, a cramped conference space above a warehouse, peeling paint on the walls, Dad at the head of the table coughing into a handkerchief. Daniel had been late that day, again. I'd presented a restructuring plan that would have saved us months of bleeding. Dad hadn't even looked at the slides. Daniel will handle it, he'd said. He has instincts. The memory still burned. This is about balance, I finally said, and consequences. Claire nodded, but I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. The call came late on a Friday, our mother. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Why are you doing this to your brother? She asked without preamble, her voice tired rather than angry. I closed my eyes. He fired me. You embarrassed him, she said. He's barely sleeping. So am I supposed to feel guilty? I asked quietly. After everything, there was a pause. Your father wanted peace between you. My father wanted the company to survive, I replied. He trusted me to make sure of that. Another pause, longer this time. Daniel says you've always been jealous, she said softly. That one hurt more than I expected. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Jealous of what? Being unprepared, being praised for other people's work. She sighed. He's my son, so am I. The line went quiet. After that, the gloves came off. Daniel started leaking stories. Anonymous tips to business blogs, vague accusations about shadow control, and unofficial power structures. Nothing concrete. Just enough to raise eyebrows. I responded the only way that mattered. Numbers. When the quarterly report landed, it told a brutal story. Declining confidence, delayed growth. Operational instability tied directly to executive decisions made after my termination. The board noticed, investors noticed, Daniel noticed most of all. He showed up at my office unannounced the following Tuesday. The receptionist buzzed me, her voice tight. He's here. Send him in, I said. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, eyes ringed with red. That suit hung off him now like a costume. He didn't sit. You want the company, he said. I already have influence, I replied. That's not the same thing. You're destroying me, he said, his voice cracking despite himself. I studied him for a long moment. I warned you. I said finally, years ago, I told you to learn the business, to respect the people who actually run it. You undermined me from the start? He snapped, no. I said, I protected you. There's a difference. He laughed bitterly. You always do that. Twist words, make yourself the hero. I don't need to be the hero. I said, I just refuse to be the scapegoat. He slammed his hand on the desk. What do you want? There it was. I stood and walked over to a cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a single folder. Thinner than the others, lighter. I want you to step down. I said, gracefully, publicly, say it's health, related, say it's strategic, I don't care. And you, he asked. I don't take your job, I said. The board appoints an interim CEO, someone competent. I stay where I am. He stared at the folder, and if I don't. I met his eyes, then the next report will be worse, and the one after that worse still. Eventually the board won't ask. His shoulders sagged. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost, I gave you a chance, he said quietly. No. I replied, I gave you cover, you wasted it. He left without taking the folder. The following week, the board called another meeting. This time, Daniel didn't sit at the head. He announced his resignation in a voice that barely held together, cited exhaustion, the need for reflection, the importance of the company's future. Applause followed. Polite, relieved, I watched from my seat, expression neutral, hands folded. When it was over, he passed me without looking. That night, alone on my balcony again, I poured a drink and watched the city breathe. It should have felt like victory, but revenge, I was learning, doesn't always taste the way you expect. Daniel disappeared after the resignation, not dramatically, no farewell emails, no emotional interviews. He simply stopped answering calls, stopped responding to messages, and faded out of the carefully managed narrative the board had built around his exhaustion. For a while, people assumed that was the end of it. A wounded ego licking its wounds somewhere expensive and private. I knew better. People like Daniel don't retreat. They regroup. The interim CEO settled in quickly. a quiet operator with decades of operational experience and none of Daniel's need to be admired. For the first time in years, the company felt steady, meetings were shorter, decisions were backed by data instead of instincts. Staff morale improved in small, visible ways. Laughter in hallways, fewer late, night panic emails. I stayed where I was exactly as promised, influence without title, control without spotlight. That should have been enough. It wasn't. The first sign came as a courtesy call from one of our external auditors. Friendly tone, careful wording. There's been an inquiry, he said. Nothing formal yet. Just a request for clarification on historical governance structures. I thanked him and hung up slowly. Inquiry meant accusation hadn't formed yet. It meant someone was asking questions, trying to shape a story before the facts arrived. Only one person would bother. I pulled older files that afternoon, tracing access logs, communication trails, permissions. Daniel hadn't been idle. He'd been planting seeds, subtle suggestions to regulators, whispers to minority shareholders about concentration of influence and undisclosed authority. The same phrases he'd leaked to the blogs, now dressed up in official language. If I were sloppy, it might have worked, but Daniel made the same mistake he always did. He assumed I'd react emotionally. Instead, I prepared. By the time the formal notice arrived, a request for interviews, documents, timelines, I already had everything indexed, cross-referenced, and waiting. Claire watched me work late into the night, the glow of screens reflecting in her glasses. "You could crush him," she said quietly. "You have proof he initiated this maliciously." "Yes," I said, and then what? She didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. Crushing him publicly would satisfy something small and sharp inside me. But it would stain the company, reopen family wounds, and turn a clean victory into a mess that would never quite wash out. I wanted something else. The interviews were dull, painfully dull. Regulators asking careful questions, trying to sound neutral. I answered calmly, precisely, never more than asked. Every claim Daniel had implied dissolved under documentation. Every concern traced back to approved structures, signed resolutions, and board awareness. By the third meeting, the tone had changed. By the fifth, they were apologetic. "This appears to be a personal dispute," one of them said gently. I nodded. "I'm afraid so." They closed the inquiry 2 weeks later. No announcement, no drama, just a letter confirming compliance. Daniel, however, didn't know that yet. He found out when his lawyer called him. I wasn't there, but I imagined the moment clearly, the tightening of his jaw, the sudden realization that his last move had failed. Not loudly, not spectacularly, but completely. He called me that night. I almost didn't answer. Almost. "What do you want?" I asked, a long pause. Then, very quietly, "You could have ruined me." "I chose not to," I replied. "Why?" His voice sounded older somehow, smaller. I leaned against the balcony railing. The city stretched out below me like a circuit board. "Because I don't need to." Another pause. "You think this makes you better than me?" "No," I said honestly. "It just makes me finished." He exhaled shakily. "I don't know who I am without this." For a second, I saw the boy again, the one hiding behind warehouse shelves, the one who wanted approval more than understanding. "You could learn," I said, "if you wanted to." Silence. "I'm leaving the city," he said finally, "selling what's left of my shares." "That's probably wise," I replied. He laughed softly. "You always talk like this was inevitable." "It wasn't," I said. "You made it so." The line went dead. Months passed. The company thrived quietly, efficiently, profitably. I watched from the edges, stepping in when needed, stepping back when not. For the first time in a decade, my life wasn't consumed by damage control. I slept, I traveled, I said no to things that didn't matter. One afternoon, I visited Dad's grave alone. I didn't tell him I'd won. I told him the company was safe. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed with a notification, confirmation of a final transaction. Daniel's remaining stake transferred, the last formal tie severed. I stood there for a long moment, the wind moving through the trees, and felt something loosen inside my chest. The laughter stopped gradually. Not all at once, not with some dramatic realization, but the way background noise fades when you leave a crowded room and don't notice the silence until you're already outside. For months, my life had been fueled by momentum. Planning, anticipating, countering. When Daniel finally sold his remaining shares and vanished from the orbit of the company, that momentum had nowhere left to go. For the first time in years, there was nothing chasing me. The interim CEO asked me one morning if I wanted to return officially, take a title again, step back into the visible structure. He framed it as recognition, as closure. I declined, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. Power had taught me its final lesson. Once you understand it, you don't crave it the same way anymore. I reduced my involvement slowly, deliberately, fewer meetings, fewer calls. I trained replacements the way Dad never trained Daniel. Patiently, thoroughly, without ego. I watched younger executives step into competence instead of confidence, and it felt right. People still treated me carefully, like someone who might pull a lever they couldn't see. I let them. Fear, I'd learned, was a tool, but distance was freedom. The message from Daniel came 6 months later, just one line. I think I finally understand what you were protecting. I read it twice, then I put the phone down and didn't reply, because some conversations only exist to prove they're no longer necessary. I moved out of the city not long after, nothing dramatic. A smaller place near the coast, where the mornings were quiet and the evenings smelled like salt instead of concrete. I started waking up early for reasons that had nothing to do with deadlines. I read books I'd bought years ago and never opened. I cooked meals slowly, the way people do when they're not eating between calls. Occasionally, someone would recognize my name, ask about the company, about the family conflict they'd read about in some carefully worded article. I always gave the same answer. It worked out, and it had, not because I'd won, but because I'd stopped needing to. One afternoon, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped low, I finally understood why I'd laughed that day in the boardroom. It hadn't been arrogance, it hadn't even been revenge. It was relief that the pretending was over, that I no longer had to make myself smaller so someone else could feel taller, that the weight I'd carried for years had finally shifted, not onto Daniel, not onto the company, but off my shoulders entirely. People think revenge is loud. They imagine shouting, humiliation, public collapse. But real revenge, the kind that lasts, is quiet. It's walking away intact while the other person is still trying to understand what happened. It's knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to, because you don't need to prove anything anymore. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that meeting, the polished table, Daniel's rehearsed confidence, the sentence he thought would end me, clear your office by tomorrow. I smile when I remember it. Because I did. I cleared the office that trapped me. I walked out of the role that limited me, and the next morning, the one he thought would be fun for him, turned out to be the beginning of the rest of my life. Not louder, not richer, just finally, unmistakably my own.